One question that tends to come up for 3D Coat users when they're getting into using 3D Coat and trying to import their own work, this comes up a lot. They want to import their own already made work into 3D Coat and start working with it. So in relation to the voxel room, and you can go to these rooms whether or not you use the menu here. You want to, there's like several ways to do this, and it's a lot like a lot of other programs. Say Maya comes to mind, where there's different ways to do the same thing. But essentially what you can do is you can go straight from this menu that appears and say import image as a mesh, which I haven't tried that yet, but that particular feature is supposed to almost work like, if I remember correctly, like a shadow box in ZBrush, where you import an image and it tries to create a 3D representation of what that image is, but it's not as fancy as it sounds. It's actually generally not even, for at least for my purposes, not very useful. But it can be to get general shapes. It doesn't take an image and then all of a sudden make say an image of a head into a head and that kind of thing. It's a little more simplified than that. But you can go with, say, voxel or surface mode. We touched on both of those in the voxel menu, and say click on one of them and then click on this file. And then when you do that, it brings up say, different things that you may have created before. Go to those in the folders and look for any of these file types. So OBJ, LWO, which is Lightwave, FBX, STL, any of these that you see here. .3b is the normal extension for a 3D Coat native file. But if you're trying to pass things between applications, you can use any one of these file formats. The one that I typically use are .obj or .fbx. FBX is more proprietary to Autodesk products, but there are cases where you can find other software that can export or import FBX, such as 3D Coat. But I find OBJ to be a very worthy competitor to it, so to speak, because it's more open to a lot of other programs. So I'm going to pick something. I'm going to go to organic. I'm going to find like an OBJ that I've already made. So let's just go with this one. And we'll just pull in one of these. In fact, here's one that I pulled in from Max. And so what I tend to do is name my files from Max, from Z for ZBrush, from 3D Coat, whatever, and that way I know they're there. Now, it looks like this model is in the scene, but it's actually not. So it's like anything else. In order to get this in, you have to hit Enter or hit Apply up here. And you certainly can mess with these different settings, but the one that I find tends to work the best, and most people do too, is merge to, I merge to separate volumes if there are separate volumes, but merge without voxelizing. If you're going into surface mode, a lot of people have success with this, where you don't want it voxelized. You just want it to bring it in as a surface, kind of like the standard polygonal mesh, but it's not really even made of polygons, so to speak. It's just it works more like a polygonal mesh. But if you want to bring it into the voxel room and you are in voxel mode, if you recall, I went to the menu and said bring it in voxel mode, then I either can check or not check that depending on which one works best for me. If you merge as skin, I believe it also definitely makes it as a hollow thing that you can work with. So that might be useful for clothing. That way it doesn't fill in the holes. And there are other settings here, and you can read through these, but like if you had a volume that was already had a negative space inside it, this will cut a negative space in all the child volumes that go in as you're importing. You can respect negative volumes, which basically means it's saying if sub object of merged object has negative, in other words, you've named something as a Boolean to be subtracted, then you name it underscore negative before you bring it in. In the name, this option will allow that to subtract that volume from the scene before merging with other sub-objects. So it will subtract it from whatever it's coming in with, and that way you get that Boolean operation off the cuff. and then merge to separate instances, merge every copy of a merged object to a separate instance. So you can have multiple copies of the same thing brought in, but bring them in as, again, separate instances. You can click auto scale, and it will try to put it at a scale that's easiest to work with. Your poly count may raise or lower as a result, but your scale will definitely also, be increased or decreased. So watch out for this if you want to keep your scale the same. And there's different things you can do here. For some reason that your origin is not centered, say, on this model, because let's say in 3D Studio Max, I had brought it down to the base of the hip here, then I can actually go to bound center, and it'll bring it to the center of the model if I want to. There's other ways to align your gizmo, and also to align your model before you bring it in. So if I say move only gizmo, at this point, if I try to move this around, then it will move to any point that I set it to without actually adjusting where the model lies in the scene. So let's turn our grid on for a second. If I had modeled this model in, say, 3D Studio Max, and oops, let me turn that little checkbox off, and for some reason I had kept its point of origin not in the center of the chest, and say back from the center space in the grid, in fact, let's turn on our axes so we could see that, then it would come in that relative space to the origin. So where you have it in the origin, in relation to the origin in one program, when you export it, it should come into 3D Coat the same way. And that's useful if, let's say I had modeled this guy and a motorcycle, then he'd be sitting on the motorcycle where he's supposed to, and they won't be both centered to the world unless I choose to do so. And then, of course, you can scale it. You can do different things there. You can pick from a Retopo mesh. If for some reason you had exported one and wanted to bring that in, you can make the mesh closed if it was an open mesh and you need it to be filled. I'm not sure what on pin is. It says use the pin to place the merge. Okay, so you would place it wherever you had put if you're using a drawing tablet where your pin is. You can subdivide it before you bring it in. And that can be useful if you find that bringing it in for some reason made it, maybe the fidelity wasn't as good. You could subdivide it before you bring it in, and then select a mesh to merge. It should be closed and not self-intersecting. So this is something you'll run into on occasion with 3D Coat. In general, is that there are times when things intersect upon themselves, and then that's called a self-intersection, and that can be problematic. But there are ways to work around that. But for the most part, you shouldn't run into any problems. I'm going to hit Enter, or you can hit Apply up here on this menu. And if you can't see it, just click on that little arrow and you'll see Apply. Now it's going to prompt me, and it'll say, is this the first time you've tried to merge an object into the scene? You want to keep the initial scale and position of the object to export for later. If you click yes, 3D Coat will preserve the dimensions of the object for export later, and that way it comes back into your other application exactly where you had it. So I'm going to say yes, and now I can start working on this body, this mesh. I can start. Whoops. And if you ever, for some reason, if you ever accidentally undo something, you can press Control Y, and it will redo it. Or of course, you can go up to the menu and hit Redo. But Control Z undoes or does an undo operation, and then Control Y will redo it. So I can literally, now that I have this in the scene, or should have, hold on 1 second, I think I messed that up, is it will bring it into its own layer, but it's a child of the layer you have selected. If you didn't want to do that, that's okay. So I'm actually going to delete this before I work on it, just to show you something. So I can actually, if I want this to be the parent, or its parent to be the root, I can right click and say change parent root. But if for some reason I wanted it on the layer I'm in, I can actually right click on that layer and go to import, merge object, and then grab that same one or a different one, which in this case is a different one, came in from ZBrush, but it should look the same, more or less. And I'll hit enter. And this one may or may not be larger, depending on what I had done to it in ZBrush. But I think I was just testing out different applications at the time. Oh, that's funny. It came in actually on a separate layer again. But again, like I said, you can go and right click and say change its parent to root, and then you can turn it on or off, and then you can work on this other layer if you want, or you can just remove it, etc. You can double click and rename it. So I'll just say man or male, and then I can literally just start sculpting on it. Now that I have that layer selected, let's hit our E panel by pressing E, and then I can sculpt and do whatever I want to with this. So I can change and sculpt and whatnot. If I want to export, we'll say that for a different video because this one's getting pretty long, but you can do that as well. So you can bounce back and forth between different applications and 3D Coat. So that is importing a model into the Voxel room and being able to work with it. Next, we'll talk about how to export a model from the Voxel room.